Do you hesitate to publicly be identified with Jesus because you don't want to be scorned or chided? No one ever wants to be disapproved of or looked down on. I've hated that since kindergarten. But Jesus himself was insulted like this, yet he didn't waver. And we see him in Psalm 69. Psalm 69 is a psalm of David. David's overwhelmed by enemies who are reproaching him. They attack him like a flood, and verse 4 says they hate him without a cause. So their persecution of him is unjust and it's undeserving, even though David admits guilt in verse 5. He says, "O God, you know my folly. The wrongs that I have done are not hidden from you." See, David is penitent before the Lord. Verses 10 and 11 say that he wept and humbled himself with fasting and sackcloth, and therefore he can confidently say, verse 9, "Zeal for your house has consumed me, and the reproaches of those who reproach you, O God, have fallen on me." David is being dishonored and shamed by those whose real criticism is with God himself. And so it's right for him to plead for God's salvation. That's verses 16 through 21. And it's right for him to request judgment on these enemies, verses 22 through 28. And finally, in the last 8 verses, David celebrates his future deliverance, which he knows is coming both for him and for the nation of Israel. Now, Psalm 69 shows us Jesus. That's evident because it's quoted at least 6 times in the New Testament, and it's applied directly to Jesus and to his enemies. And Judas is one example of an enemy. In Acts 1:20, Peter uses verse 25 of Psalm 69 to describe Judas's judgment. And the insults that were hurled at Jesus came without a cause. That's what verse 4 here says. Jesus quotes that himself in John 15:25. See, Jesus didn't have to confess to his own folly and his own wrongs, did he? He was without sin. Yet he was still reproached because he came as a humble Savior who would be struck down but for the sins of others. A crucified Savior made the Jewish leaders reproach God. And those same reproaches, verse 9, fell on Jesus. That's how Paul interprets it in Romans 15:3. Yet, zeal for God's house consumed Jesus. You know how John refers to this verse in John 2:17. Jesus could endure hostility because he was focused on the steadfast love of his Father, and he entrusted his own deliverance and the judgment of his enemies into God's hands. So how about you today? How are you doing when there's a risk of being insulted or chided for Christ's sake? I get that you don't want to be reproached, nobody does, but your safe deliverance is in God's hands, and justice is in God's hands. You can trust God to strengthen you so that you can be like Jesus and withstand reproach, endure reproach. So be a bold witness for Jesus Christ and don't let the opinions of others cause you to shrink back.